I got my tea, I'm in my robe, sitting in my chair, nice and warm, and I want to have a discussion about something that's been on my mind for a while now, and that is, the Airstrike is in a weird place. It's not necessarily a bad weapon, but these days most players have set it aside in favor of other options. But why? The Airstrike doesn't really have a bad reputation, nor does it really have any serious mechanical flaws with its design. But for some reason, I rarely see the Airstrike used in game. Now, the current stats on the Airstrike include a 65% faster firing rate while rocket jumping, 15% less self-damage from said rocket jumps, and a clip size that grows by 1 for every kill that you get, capped at a maximum of 8 rockets in your clip. As a trade-off for this, your rockets have a 10% smaller blast radius and a 15% damage penalty. And, while you are rocket jumping, your blast radius is decreased by an additional 20%, bringing it down to roughly 30% smaller than normal. The general idea behind the Airstrike is for a player to have airborne superiority in terms of damage output. And to balance things out, the weapon is supposed to be weaker when you are on the ground. This sounds like a fair trade-off, but the lack of use got me really curious, so I tried out the Airstrike for myself for a few hours, and then 10 hours, and then 50 hours. And well, the Airstrike isn't good, but it's almost good. So here's why.
We cut down my percentage. Cigar? Liable to interfere with my aim.
Let's start picking this item apart. What is currently good about the Airstrike? Obviously, we have that faster firing rate while rocket jumping, and that clip size that grows by 1 for every kill that you get. These stats can let the Airstrike do more damage than the stock rocket launcher, at least in some scenarios. While on the ground, the stock rocket launcher will always do more damage than the Airstrike, at least for the first 4 rockets. Each stock rocket has a base damage of 90, and the Airstrike does 76 thanks to that 15% damage penalty. The base firing rate on both of these rocket launchers is the same, 0.8 seconds between each shot. The reload rates are also the same. Reloading the first rocket takes 0.92 seconds, and each consecutive reload takes 0.8 seconds. Now, in order to make up for that 15% damage penalty on the Airstrike, you would need to fire 1 extra rocket for every 4 shots fired, meaning you take an extra 1 second to deal out the same amount of damage as a fully loaded stock rocket launcher. But the Airstrike's clip size grows by 1 for every kill that you get. What happens to this damage difference over time if you were to max this out to 8 rockets? Let's say you've done this. This means you can fire 8 shots, grounded or rocket jumping, without having to reload. Assuming base damage, and assuming you are on the ground again, you can fire 8 76 damage rockets in 6.4 seconds for a total of 608 damage. Now, let's compare this to the stock rocket launcher. You can fire 4 90 damage rockets in 3.2 seconds for a total of 360 damage. But then, you gotta reload. By the time you've reloaded and fired your 5th stock rocket, the Airstrike will have already fired 2 more, matching the stock rocket launcher's damage output. And by the time the stock rocket launcher has reloaded and fired its 6th shot, the Airstrike will have completely emptied its 8-rocket clip, actually overtaking the damage output of the stock rocket launcher. So, after about 5 seconds, the Airstrike can start out-damaging the stock rocket launcher, so long as a player has at least 6 rockets in his clip. Yes, that is slow, and it's not that much of a difference, but what if you are airborne? Using the base firing rate of 0.8 seconds, and the Airstrike does 95 damage per second on the ground, and the stock rocket launcher does 112.5. But when rocket jumping, the Airstrike's firing rate jumps to 0.28 seconds between each shot, boosting its DPS to a whopping 271. That's more than double the damage output rate of stock, which just stays at 112.5 no matter what you're doing. Yes, blast radius and fall-off percentages affect these values, but when airborne, you crank out twice the amount of damage as the stock rocket launcher over the same period of time, without the need to fire all of your rockets, let alone 6 to 8 of them. This means a higher burst damage potential when using the Airstrike at any time without the need for a larger clip size, but only when used properly. A lot of people who use the Airstrike tend to do this. No. Now, I understand that you may be tempted to pair the Airstrike with the base jumper, either because they're both green, or because they both got added in the same update, or maybe because they seem like the ideal fucking combination, right? You stay in the air longer, so you fire all of your rockets faster, and that means more damage. It makes some sort of sick intuitive sense, but here is the problem. When you are performing these long, lofty pencil jumps with the base jumper, you are staying further away from your target. For those unaware about how damage fall-off works on soldier rockets, it's calculated based on how close the soldier is to his rockets, not how far they have traveled. So, when you volley yourself into the air with the base jumper, you are not only making yourself a sitting duck to anyone with half a brain, but you are increasing the distance between you and your target, and this decreases your damage output. Instead, the general idea behind using the Airstrike is to close the distance between you and your target. This is so you can reduce the effects of the damage and blast radius penalties, and to exploit your faster firing speed, and this is best done with soldier bombing. With a typical bomb, a soldier rocket jumps at his target, firing rockets as he flies through the air. He then lands at his target just before his rockets do, and usually fires off another rocket right as he lands. Immediately after, his fired rockets catch up, land, and deal crazy amounts of damage because he is basically inside of his own rockets, minimizing the damage fall-off to nearly zero. And what's more, the Airstrike is the ultimate bombing tool. You can throw yourself at the enemy team using a bomb, firing off more than twice as many rockets as the stock rocket launcher, and deal a load of damage by the time you land. Plus, your growing clip size allows for you to do this multiple times without having to reload. And again, you don't need to vomit out your entire clip during a bomb to out-damage the stock rocket launcher. Firing off 3 or 4 rockets is more than enough to dish out some serious pain, so you really only need a clip size of 5 or 6 to really hammer it on. So, the good aspects of the Airstrike are: double the damage output rate while rocket jumping, a growing clip size to bomb in more often to make use of this faster firing rate, and the ability to out-damage the stock rocket launcher over longer periods of time and in certain scenarios.
Adios, half soldier.
Unfortunately, in practice, all of the positive aspects about the Airstrike simply are not as good as advertised. For starters, my idealized scenarios where the Airstrike can start out-damaging the stock rocket launcher assume that you are hitting every single shot directly, or as close to directly as possible. Sadly, this just doesn't happen with any rocket launcher. At greater range, you will be hitting more splash damage rather than direct damage, and unless your target happens to be stationary, you will simply miss more shots taken at targets that are further away. This means that you will have to rely more on splash damage, which unfortunately is very hard to do with the Airstrike. It has a 10% smaller blast radius and a 15% damage penalty. Now, these may not sound like much, but first off, that smaller blast radius means that you will simply miss more shots with the Airstrike in general. And on top of that, coming in second, we have the 15% damage penalty, which means even less damage on already weaker rockets. Not only will it be very hard to land shots on targets that are at any range, but even when they do hit, they will do way less damage. In order to compensate for these downsides, players must get very close to their targets, which, as I've mentioned in the past, isn't really good for longevity. While grounded, you can still handle light classes fairly easily with the Airstrike, but you will be at a serious disadvantage against heavier or overhealed classes, even with a larger clip size. This means that players need to rocket jump to make use of that faster firing speed to have any serious chance against heavier classes or groups of players. Yes, these negative stats are necessary to balance out the Airstrike's potential for higher burst damage, which I have shown to be potentially very powerful. The damage balancing for the Airstrike appears fair, and yet it still isn't a good weapon.
When you have to shoot, shoot, don't talk.
Were this the end of the story, the Airstrike would be completely fine. Unfortunately, like I've said, the Airstrike isn't good. It's almost good. One thing holds the Airstrike back: rocket jumping. In order to make use of the Airstrike to its fullest potential, rocket jumping isn't just a requirement, it's an absolute necessity. Sadly, this primary has too many negative attributes that prevent you from doing so, or even wanting to do so. First of all, you still take a lot of damage when you rocket jump. Without gunboats, you take 23 to 39 self-damage when you rocket jump with the Airstrike. Even with that 15% reduction in self-damage from blast jumps, it's not that much of an improvement over the stock rocket launcher's 27 to 46 self-damage. This problem forces players to use the gunboats if they want to use the Airstrike effectively, but if they don't use the gunboats, they are stuck on the ground more often than not, which means even less damage output in the long run. Now, you could use a secondary of any kind, but at that point, you might as well just use the stock rocket launcher, unless you want a medic shoved in your ass so you can jump more often to make up for that lack of damage output. Second, your blast radius is further reduced by that additional 20% while rocket jumping. This means even less damage when you do have the opportunity to jump at your targets, because you are more likely going to miss your shots, even at close range. It's meant to balance out your airborne superiority, but in action, it's just way too punishing and simply counterintuitive to the weapon's design. Think about this for a minute. Why would a player rocket jump when they know that their damage output is going to be reduced by the weapon that promotes rocket jumping? It makes no sense. Third, you have the need to reload. You have a larger clip size, so the more often you rocket jump and fire off shots with your faster firing speed, the more often you need to reload in order to do it again. This means more time spent reloading rather than shooting. This is an unwritten punishment while using the Airstrike, but it becomes painfully evident when in play. Again, it's meant to balance out that airborne superiority, but this issue hardly lets you get off the ground in the first place. These three things, paired with the fall damage that you take after rocket jumping, makes playing with the Airstrike feel extremely sluggish in comparison to other rocket launchers. The purpose of the Airstrike is to rocket jump so you can make use of its faster firing speed, but at every opportunity, you are punished way too heavily for doing so, because you have that self-damage issue from blast jumps, the reduced damage and blast radius penalties, and the need to reload more often. Put simply, the current design of the Airstrike is like a race car with a 2-ton chassis and wooden wheels. It can go fast, it's just holding itself back. In my opinion, the Airstrike just needs one simple tweak in order to make it a viable alternative to stock. Either reduce the amount of self-damage taken from blast jumping, remove the 20% reduction in blast radius while rocket jumping, or increase the reload rate. If any one of these things were to be changed, the Airstrike would be perfect. But hey, take your pick. Let me know what you guys think would be a good fix for the Airstrike in the comments, or if it even needs one. I'm curious to see if other people have the same experiences as I do with this weapon. But All I know for now is that I too will likely be sticking with other rocket launchers for the foreseeable future. And that's a wrap. Don't get me wrong here, the Airstrike is fun to use. It's a pretty good weapon in practiced hands, and it can be a fun change of pace for someone wanting to try out something different. It's a really great feeling to get a solid bomb off with the Airstrike, and it's a useful tool against engineer nests and players that are standing still. But sadly, the Airstrike is just too slow for me to play with, because a lot of its attributes are counterintuitive to its design and its intended playstyle. As of now, the stock rocket launcher is simply better in all scenarios because the Airstrike's damage output is just too low thanks to its drawbacks. It's not even worth doing a versus episode for it in my opinion. Peace out.
Hey, blood! You know what you are! Just a dirty son of a...
Alright, ready? 3, 2, 1, go.
God damn it!
Why'd you do that? Now we have to do it again!